Now we start off with project management concepts with chapter 1. So what is a project? Well, a project is a time-bound endeavor to achieve a specific objective through a set of interrelated activities and the effective utilization of resources. So what are some project attributes? Well, there has to be a clear objective, a series of interdependent activities, various resources, a specific time frame, a unique one-time endeavor, a sponsor or a customer, and a degree of uncertainty. Now let's talk about balancing project constraints. So these are factors that constrain project success. So the first one we look at is scope. This is all the work that must be done to produce the project deliverables. So the products to be provided. So these need to satisfy the customer and achieve the project objective. Next we look at quality, the degree to which the performance of a product or service meets expectations. Then we look at schedule. This is the timetable that states when each specific activity should start and finish to meet project completion date. Then we look at the budget. This is the amount of money the sponsor or customer has agreed to pay for acceptable project deliverables. And then the other project constraint is resources. These are various resources needed to perform the project activities, deliverables, and achieve the project objective. And then we have risks. These are the downside risks that adversely affect achieving the project objective. And then we have customer satisfaction, meeting the customer's expectations, developing and maintaining excellent working relationships, so communication. And then the last project constraint we have is stakeholders. So the project manager and the team need to build a relationship and engage various stakeholders who influence or are affected by the project and gain their support. So all 7 of these were project constraints. So what are some of the actions of project managers? Well, they have to prevent, anticipate, and overcome. They should have good planning and communication and be responsible. Now let's take a look at the project life cycle. So the project life cycle includes the initiating, the planning, the performing, and the closing phase. On a graph, you'll have effort on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what you see is that the level of effort increases as time goes forward and then reaches a maximum around the performing phase and then starts to gradually fall down to the closing phase. And as you move along from the initiating to the planning phase, you'll have the project charter, then the baseline plan, and then after the performing phase, you'll have the accepted deliverables in the closing phase, and the archived project documents. But now let's take a look at these phases more closely. So the first phase, the initiating phase, is where you identify a need, a problem, or an opportunity, and then you determine whether to select the project. And then you also develop the project charter. So in the project charter, you'll have the rationale, the project objective, expected benefits, general requirements and conditions. And then you'll also have to decide if the RFP is needed. And the RFP is the request for proposal. Then we move on to the planning phase, so the second phase. This is where you show how the project scope will be achieved. You plan the work and work the plan. Then you also develop a baseline plan here. So the baseline plan will include what needs to be done, right? The scope and the deliverables. How will it get done? The activities and the sequence. Who will do it? The resources and the responsibilities. How long will it take? The durations and the schedule. How much will it cost? The budget. And what are the risks? And then in the planning phase, you'll also have actual resources and plan the work. Then we move on to the third phase, the performing phase. Here you need to achieve project objectives. So here the project manager leads, the project team completes the project. And here you also need to increase the pace as more resources are added. And you also need to monitor and control progress and then take corrective action as needed. And then manage and control changes with sponsor approval. Then achieve customer satisfaction with acceptance of deliverables. And then we move on to the fourth and final phase, the closing phase. Here you must collect and make final payments, recognize and evaluate staff, conduct post-project evaluation, document lessons learned, archive project documents, and record lessons. So we looked at what a project is, but what is project management? Well, this is the planning, organizing, coordinating, leading, and controlling of resources to achieve the project objectives. And now let's take a look at the project planning process. So here you're going to establish the project objective, and then you need to define the scope, and then you need to create a work breakdown structure, WBS. Then in it, you need to assign responsibility and define specific activities. And then after that, you need to sequence activities. So here you need to estimate activity resources, estimate activity durations. And then you need to develop a project schedule. So estimate activity costs and then determine the budget. So the big things you need to do in the project planning process is obviously establish the project objective, define the scope, create the work breakdown structure, sequence activities, develop project schedule, and determine the budget. And then you need to execute the project plan. So this is where you perform the work, monitor and control progress, and control changes. But now let's speak a bit about stakeholder engagement. So who are stakeholders? So this could be the customer or sponsor, the project team, which includes the subcontractors and suppliers. Then we have organizations and other groups. So these groups or organizations could be supportive or adversarial, and they want to be kept informed because of the potential impact. So under stakeholder engagement, we have to create a stakeholder register. So this is created to identify the different stakeholders. So it includes key contact information, role or topics of interest, expectations, any known issues, areas of potential influence. And then under stakeholder engagement, we also have to create an issue log. Now let's talk a bit about global project management. So global project management adds a dimension of complexity, and it changes project dynamics, and it requires awareness of factors, so cultural differences, currency, codes and regulations, workforce availability, political relations, and business organization. So what are some helpful competencies in this area of global project management? Well, foreign language skills are good, knowledge of cultures, geography, world history, and contemporary events, including international economics, is good. Awareness of customs and etiquette, geopolitical environment, technology adoption, and translation software. So what are some project management associations? Well, we have the Project Management Institute. So this is a premier worldwide non-profit association for practitioners in the project management profession. So what are some critical success factors in project management? Well, it's planning and communication, so to prevent problems or minimize problems' impacts. The project must have a clear objective of what's to be achieved in terms of the end product, and it should be agreed upon by the customer. And then you also need to involve the sponsor or customer as a partner. There also needs to be ongoing communication with the customer to keep them informed. And you also need to be measuring actual progress of a project and comparing it to planned progress and taking corrective action where needed. And then after conclusion of the project performance should be evaluated to learn what could be improved, and then feedback should be obtained from the sponsor or customer. And then there also needs to be learning and understanding the culture and customs of other project participants, and this demonstrates respect and helps build trust, etc. Now let's move on to identifying and selecting projects with Chapter 2. So project identification happens at the start of the initiating phase. And this is when you recognize a need, problem, or opportunity. And there's various ways for identification. So organization strategic planning, response to unexpected events, or a group organized to address a need. So it's important to clearly identify a need to determine if it's worth pursuing. And you need to use a decision-making process to prioritize and select project with greatest need. And then we move on to project selection. So here you evaluate the needs, the costs, and the benefits. You determine which are projects and you select the project. So you develop criteria, you list assumptions, gather data, and evaluate each opportunity. So here you're basically combining your gut feelings and quantitative information to make a decision. Then we move on to creating the project charter, and this is done once the project is selected. And this provides sponsor approval, commits funding for the project, summarizes key conditions and parameters, and establishes the framework to develop the baseline plan. So this is the purpose of the project charter, and it's only done once the project is actually selected. But what are the possible elements of a project charter? Well, we have the project title, the purpose, description, funding, major deliverables, acceptance criteria, milestone schedule, project manager, key assumptions, constraints, approval requirements, and major risks. Now let's talk about preparing a request for proposal, an RFP. So we do this when a decision is made to outsource to an external resource or contractor. So in the RFP, you comprehensively describe project requirements, and this includes the need, problem, or opportunity description, allows contractors to develop a thorough proposal and then facilitates the development of evaluation criteria. And this may be communicated informally, formally, in writing, or verbally. So, but what are some of the guidelines for developing an RFP? Well, you need to state the project objective or purpose. You need to provide a statement of work. It needs to include customer requirements, state deliverables the customer expects, state acceptance criteria, list customer supplied items, state approvals required, state the type of contract, state the payment terms, state the schedule and milestones, indicate the due date, include evaluation criteria, and include the level of effort or funds available. Let's talk a bit about soliciting proposals. Solicitation. So here you notify potential contractors. You identify selected group in advance to send copy. You advertise in selected journals, newspapers, or websites. Then you also have to maintain competitive situation. So provide equal information to all bidders and hold bidders meeting to answer questions. So you notify potential contractors that, hey, we want to do this project, can you do it? So some of the conditions in the proposal is that the requirements are sometimes communicated verbally instead of via a formal RFP. And then all RFPs start with an identification of a need, problem, or opportunity. So now let's take a look at some of the critical success factors under the whole identifying and selecting projects chapter. So the need must be clearly defined before preparing a request for proposal. And then when selecting a project, the decision should be based on which project will provide the greatest overall benefits compared to its costs or consequences. And then you need to have a well understood evaluation and selection process. Then establish quantitative project success criteria or expected benefits. The RFP should allow contractors to understand customers' needs and requirements. And then the RFP should include a statement of work, customer requirements, expected deliverables, and criteria by which customer will evaluate the proposals. The RFP should also provide instructions for the format and content of contractor proposals so the customer can make a fair comparison. And also, customers shouldn't provide information to only a few contractors, giving them an unfair competitive advantage. Now we move on to defining scope, quality, responsibility, and activity sequence with Chapter 4. So the first thing that we have to do at the start of any project is establish the project objective. So the planning process is based on the project objective. It establishes what is to be achieved. It's often stated in the project charter or RFP, and it's the tangible end product. And the project objective also includes the expected benefits, the primary project end product or deliverable, the date required to be completed, and the budget. And the changes should be agreed upon by the customer and the contractor. Now we move on to defining the project scope. So the project scope defines what needs to be done. It includes items contained in the project charter, RFP, proposal, and more detail. It establishes a common understanding of the scope with stakeholders. So the project scope document usually includes customer requirements, statement of work, deliverables, acceptance criteria, work breakdown structure, and establishes the baseline, and it changes control system to avoid scope creep. So yeah, the statement of work, deliverables, acceptance criteria, and the work breakdown structure here, among others. Then we need to plan for quality. So you need to complete the work according to specifications and standards, and plan for assuring quality as project progresses. And this includes references for specifications and standards, and written procedures for quality tools and techniques. Then you also have to look at key aspects. So you need to monitor as the project progresses, and you do the work right the first time rather than rework. And now we move on to constructing a work breakdown structure. But what is a work breakdown structure? Well, it's a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition, and it's to organize project work and deliverables, create logical groupings, subdivide into more manageable components, and then the deliverable is output of work package. And then resource requirements and durations can be assigned, accountability can be assigned, and the project manager can monitor and control. And then we have a graphic chart or an indentured list. So yeah, the work breakdown structure is a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition that organizes project work and deliverables and creates logical groupings and then subdivides them into manageable components. So essentially, they're going to give you a scenario, and then whenever they say summary level or phase, you know that's going to be a deliverable. So you'll have a project, for example, a festival, and then the next summary level of phases those are the deliverables, right, on the second level. Then after that comes all the activities or components that come after that, or that compose of the deliverable. So the little boxes that stem from the main boxes that are under the title are called work packages. So the summary level or phase is a deliverable, and then the ones that stem from that are the work packages. So basically the steps in constructing a work breakdown structure is that you identify major deliverables, decompose the deliverables, continue until deliverables are the right size, and then you review. And then you have to assign responsibility. So we have the responsibility assignment matrix, and this is to designate responsible individuals. So the P means primary responsibility, and then the S means support responsibility. So associates responsibility for each work item for each individual. So we'll assign a P or an S to each individual. And then you need to know that activities define more specifically how the work will get done. And then a network diagram defines the sequence of how and when the activities will be performed. And then also you should know that project planning is a critical activity in developing an information system. And also you should know that the SDLC, the Systems Development Lifecycle, is used to help plan, execute, and control information systems development projects. So it's basically a project management tool or methodology. Okay, so now we move on to developing the schedule with Chapter 5. So we start off with estimating activity resources. So the resources include people, materials, equipment, facilities, etc. Then we take a look at the resources' influence on the duration. So the availability of resources, the types of resources, sufficient quantities of resources for the activity durations, potential conflicts with other projects. And then we have to involve the person with expertise in resource estimates. And then these estimates influence the costs. So now after estimating the activity resources, now we have to estimate activity durations. So the duration must be the total elapsed time. So the time for the work to be done and any associated waiting time. For example, we'll have a box representing an activity, for example, varnishing floors. And then in the bottom left, you're going to have the activity number. And then on the bottom right, you're going to have the estimated duration, usually in days. This is the time it'll take to actually complete the activity. So we'll have varnishing floors, activity number 1 on the left-hand side, right, bottom left. And then the number 5, so 5 days in the bottom right corner. And then after that, we move back the furniture. So after estimating activity durations, now we have to establish project start and completion times. So we have to define the overall window for project completion. And you might not want to commit to a specific date. So the project can't start until the customer has approved the contract. And delay in contract signing may impact the project start. So you need to set the finish time as the number of days from the project start. So then after establishing the project start and completion times, now we have to develop the project schedule. So you prioritize activities for scheduled development. So you estimate the duration of each activity, establish overall window of time for the project, develop the schedule timetable, so the earliest start and finish times based on estimated start date, latest start and finish times based on required completion date. So there's a difference. When you develop the schedule timetable, the earliest start and finish times are based on the estimated start date, and then the latest start and finish times are based on the required completion date. So earliest start time, ES, is the earliest time at which a specific activity can begin. And then earliest finish time, EF, is the earliest time by which a specific activity can be completed. So for the earliest start and finish times, we're going to have them on top of the activity box, just outside of it. And we're going to have the earliest start on the top left corner. And then we're going to have the earliest finish on the top right corner. And then obviously you should know the activity description is inside of the box. The activity number is on the bottom left corner. And then the estimated duration in days is on the bottom right corner. But now let's take a look at latest start and finish times. So the latest start time, LS, is the latest time by which an activity must be started. And then the latest finish time, LF, is the latest time by which a specific activity must be completed. So in order to calculate the latest start time, we get the latest finish time minus the estimated duration. And you essentially calculate backwards through the network diagram. So just like the earliest start and finish times, the latest start and latest finish times will be just outside of the activity box. then the latest start will be on the bottom left corner, then the latest finish will be on the bottom right corner. If the latest start or the latest finish is negative, it means the project is late and that you'll have to get days from other activities in order to make up for it. So you get the latest finish time, which let's say it's 7, and then you get the activity duration in the activity box. Then you'll say the 7 minus 2, and then you get 5. That's how you get the latest start. But now let's talk about total slack, or sometimes called float. So the total slack or float is the difference between the earliest finish time of the last activity and the project required completion time. For example, if the earliest finish time for the last activity was, let's say, 21 days, and it's going to be on the finish activity box, and then the required completion time was 25 days, you'd say the 25 minus the 21, and it'll give you 4 days, and that is the total slack for the project. But sometimes you can calculate the total float for a specific activity. For example, if we have an activity like cutting grass, and let's say the earliest finish time was 8 days, and then the latest finish time was 20 days, we'd subtract the latest finish time with the earliest finish time to get 12. So it's essentially the bottom right corner minus the top right corner. Or you could also calculate the total float for an activity by getting the latest start time minus the earliest start time. So, but what is negative slack? Well, this is a lack of slack over the entire project. So this is essentially the amount of time an activity must be accelerated. And then what about positive slack? Well, this is the maximum amount of time that the activities on a particular path can be delayed without jeopardizing the on-time completion. But then what is the critical path? Well, the critical path is the longest path in the overall network diagram, and it's useful to find which activities have the least amount of slack. So it's the longest path in the overall network diagram. And then what is free slack? Well, free slack, not to be confused with total slack or float, is the time a specific activity can be postponed without delaying the earliest start time of its immediate successor activities. So it's the time a specific activity can be postponed without delaying the earliest start time of the successor activity or the activity that comes after it. So the way you calculate it is that you find the lowest of the values of total slack for all the activities entering into a specific activity. Then you subtract the value from the values of total slack for the other activities also entering into that same activity. So essentially you'll have 2 activities, and then you have to have calculated the total slack or the float for each specific activity. And then these 2 activities give birth to one other activity. So both of them have to go together in order to do this activity. And then to calculate the free slack for one activity, you essentially get the difference between the total slack of both activities. For example, if we have activity 7, which has a total slack of float of 50 days, then we have activity 8 with a total slack of float of 60 days. If we want to calculate the free slack for activity 8, we'd get the total slack of float for activity 8, which is 60 days, minus the total slack of float for activity 7, 50 days. So 60 minus 50, and that gives you 10 days. So that's the free slack for activity 8. Now let's talk about determining costs, budget, and earned value with Chapter 7. So in terms of estimating activity costs, you have to look at labor, materials, equipment, reserves, facilities, subcontractors and consultants, and travel. So some good practices is to have the person responsible estimate the costs. Use historical data to inform current project. Be reasonable and realistic. Estimate near-term activities more accurately, and elaborate costs as additional info is known. So now we talk about the aggregate total budgeted cost, TBC. So here you establish a TBC for each work package. So you determine the process top-down or bottom-up. And if the sum of initial estimates exceeds sponsor budget, then reduce the cost and recalculate. So essentially you'll have a work breakdown structure with work package budgets. So at the top you might have the overall budget for the project, and then on the side you'll have your contingency, and that project budget will be split up into the different work packages. So after calculating the total budgeted cost, you have to develop the cumulative budgeted cost. So you distribute each total budgeted cost, TBC, over the work package duration, and you create a time-phased budget. You calculate the cumulative budgeted cost, and this provides a baseline against which the actual cost and work performance are measured. And then after this, we determine the actual cost. So you collect data regularly for funds actually expended, and then you charge it to the work package numbers. So those were the actual costs. And then you periodically assign a portion of total cost to actual cost, and then you include the cost for items that'll be paid for later, and these are committed costs. And then you have to compare the actual cost to the budgeted cost. So you calculate the cumulative actual cost, CAC, and then you compare it to the cumulative budgeted cost. After determining the actual cost, now we have to determine the value of work performed. So the earned value is the percentage of work done multiplied by the total budgeted cost. For example, if you had to paint 10 similar rooms and the total budgeted cost is 2,000, so our budget is 200 Rand per room, if at day 5 we find that 1,000 Rand is spent and only 3 out of the 10 rooms have been painted, then the earned value is 30% of 2,000 Rand, so 0.3 times 2,000, which gives us 600 Rand. And this would mean that we've spent or expended 400 Rand more than the earned value. So we only should have spent 600 Rand, not 1,000 Rand on painting the 3 rooms. Now let's talk about analyzing the cost performance. So there are 4 cost-related measures. The TBC, the total budgeted cost, the CBC, the cumulative budgeted cost, the CAC, the cumulative actual cost, and then the CEV, the cumulative earned value. And all of these are used to analyze the project cost performance, plot the CBC, CAC, and CEV curves on the same graph, and then reveal any trends toward improving or deteriorating cost performance. But now let's move on to the Cost Performance Index, the CPI. So the CPI is the measure of the cost efficiency with which the project is being performed. So the CPI, the Cost Performance Index, not the Consumer Price Index, is equal to CEV, the cumulative earned value, divided by CAC, the cumulative actual cost. So CPI is equal to CEV divided by CAC, KevCAC. So the CPI will be a decimal. For example, if the value of work actually performed is 54,000 and the cumulative actual cost is 68,000, so the costs actually expended, if we divide the 54k with the 68k, we get 0.79. And this means that for every 1 Rand actually spent, only 0.79 Rand of earned value was received. Now let's talk about cost variance. So cost variance is an indicator of cost performance. And this is the difference between the cumulative earned value of the work performed and the cumulative actual cost. So CV, cost variance, is equal to CEV minus CAC, the cumulative earned value minus the cumulative actual cost. For example, if the earned value is 54k and the cumulative actual cost is 68k, and we subtract them from each other and we get a negative number, let's say negative 14,000, it means that the value of work performed is 14,000 Rand less than the amount actually spent. Now let's talk about estimating the cost at completion. So this is us forecasting what the total cost will be at the completion of the project or work package. And there are 3 methods to do this. So the first one is FCAC, so the forecasted cost at completion, is equal to the total budgeted cost, TBC, divided by the cost performance index, CPI. So FCAC is equal to TBC divided by CPI. And then the other method is CAC, the cumulative actual cost, plus bracket the TBC minus the CEV, so the total budgeted cost minus the cumulative earned value. So here the forecasted cost at completion is equal to the cumulative actual cost plus the difference between the total budgeted cost and the cumulative earned value. And then the third method is the cumulative actual cost plus the re-estimate of remaining work. So FCAC is equal to CAC plus the re-estimate of remaining work. And then another method of estimating the cost at completion is the TCPI. So this is the To Complete Performance Index. So here the To Complete Performance Index is equal to the difference between the total budgeted cost minus the cumulative earned value divided by the difference between the total budgeted cost and the cumulative actual cost. So the TCPI is equal to the TBC minus the CEV divided by the TBC minus the CAC. So they'll give you the cumulative earned value, the cumulative actual cost, cost performance index, TBC, etc. And you'll have to figure out which variables to use to calculate the forecasted cost at completion. Now let's talk about controlling costs. So here we need to analyze cost performance on a regular basis. So we need to determine which work packages require corrective action, decide what specific corrective action to use, and then revise the project plan. And then we need to evaluate negative cost variance, take corrective actions, then we look at the near-term activities, and then activities with large cost estimates. Then we must reduce the cost of activities and evaluate the trade-off of cost and scope. Now let's talk about managing cash flow. So this is to ensure that cash comes in faster than it goes out. Negotiate payment terms, provide a down payment, make equal monthly payments, and provide frequent payments. So you avoid only one payment at the end of the project and you control the outflow of cash. Now we move on to managing risk with Chapter 8. Well, what is risk management? Well, this involves identifying, assessing, and responding to project risks in order to minimize the likelihood of occurrence and or potential impact of adverse events on the achievement of the project objective. So a project involves a degree of uncertainty. And you need to know that addressing risks proactively will increase the chances of achieving the project objective. And not being proactive can result in panic and costly responses. Now we move on to identifying risk. So risk identification includes determining which risks may adversely affect the project objective and what the impact of each risk might be if it occurs. And sometimes a sponsor identifies major risks in the project charter. So the way we can identify a risk is by brainstorming sources of risk. And risks that are accounted for should be somewhat likely to occur and or have a significant negative impact on achieving the project objective. And then establishing risk categories may help to identify and evaluate risks. For example, technical, cost, HR, external, or sponsor or customer risks. And then historical information from past projects can be a helpful source in identifying possible risks. And the project team can progressively elaborate and identify new risks, as well as estimated impacts of previously identified risks as more information becomes available. Now let's talk about assessing risks. So here you have to determine the likelihood the risk event will occur. And then you evaluate the degree of impact on the project objective. And then you need to prioritize. So the risks on the critical path should be given higher priority because if the risk occurs, it'd have a bigger impact on the schedule than if it is associated with activities on a path that has a large positive value of total slack. Now let's talk about the risk assessment matrix or the risk register. So this is a tool for assessing and managing the risks. It helps to list the impact of the risk, evaluate the likelihood of the occurrence, determine the degree of impact, identify the action trigger, name a person responsible, and create a responsible plan to avoid, mitigate, or accept the risk. So on the columns of the risk assessment matrix, you'll have the risk, the impact, the likelihood of occurrence, which could be low, medium, or high, the degree of impact, which could be low, medium, or high, the action trigger, the responsibility, and the response plan. For example, if the risk is that there could be rain on the day of an event, then the impact would be low attendance and incur financial loss. And then the likelihood of occurrence and degree of impact could be low, medium, or high. The action trigger could be the weather forecast 2 days before the event, and the responsibility of it could be or where to. And then the response plan could be reserving indoor space. Now let's talk about planning risk responses. So these are a set of actions to prevent or reduce the likelihood of occurrence or impact of a risk. So implementing something if the risk event occurs. So it establishes a trigger point for implementation, assigns responsibility for implementation, avoids, mitigates, or accepts the risk, and includes a contingency fund to cover the implementation cost. But now, what is the risk response plan? Well, the risk response plan is a defined set of actions that seek to prevent or reduce the likelihood of occurrence or impact of a risk. So the risk response plan is implemented if the risk event occurs. So some of the critical success factors when managing risk is identifying risks and their potential impacts before the project starts, involve the project team or experts in assessing risks, assign high priority to managing risks that have a high likelihood of occurrence and a high potential impact on the project outcome, and then develop response plans for addressing high priority risks. So now we move on to negotiations with Chapter 1. So negotiation is a key communication and influence tool. It's an interpersonal decision-making process necessary whenever we can't achieve our objectives single-handedly. And it's not just about resources, it's equally about relationships and trust. So the mind of the negotiator involves the development of deliberate, rational, and thoughtful strategies for negotiation. And then the heart of the negotiator involves relationships and trust. Now let's talk about relationships versus economics. So relationship corresponds to the heart and economics is the mind. So economics deals with economic value, money and scarce resources. And relationships deal with people, relationships and trust. Many people think you focus on being liked or getting what you want. Now let's talk about satisficing versus optimizing. So satisficing is doing just enough to reach one's minimum goals, not pushing to maximize one's potential gains. And then optimizing is where negotiators capture all of the potential gain in a situation. And now let's take a look at short versus long-term relationships. So these are single-shot negotiations versus negotiations that could potentially recur with the same party again in the future. So all negotiators should assume that the details of their negotiation will be accessible for anyone to view and that all negotiators have long-term implications. Social media has changed this perception. Now let's talk about intra versus inter-organizational negotiations. Internal negotiations might go more smoothly and collaboratively than external negotiations. However, envy and internal competition may in fact loom larger when people negotiate internally versus externally. So what about low versus high stakes negotiations? Well, a low stake negotiation is where you're not committed to a win-win situation, whereas a high stakes is where you're committed to a win-win situation. So win-win negotiations are also known as integrative agreements. And win-lose negotiations is where one party prevails over another. And then lose-lose negotiations are where both parties lose. For example, unfair dismissal. Now let's take a look at the key reasons effective negotiation skills are important. The first is the knowledge economy. The nature of knowledge and work changes over time. Managers constantly negotiate on matters involving skills, professional ID, moving jobs, entering new markets, etc. The next reason is specialized expertise. There is interdependence across fields, and incentive structures force managers to promote their own interests while creating joint value for the organization. Another reason is information technology. The availability means people can always negotiate. Text made it easy and requires more responsiveness. And the last key reason effective negotiation skills are important is globalization. Managers need to develop negotiation skills that can be employed across the globe, nationalities, contexts, and cultures. Now let's take a look at the negotiation traps. So the first one is leaving money on the table, so lose-lose. Negotiators fail to recognize and capitalize on a situation. The next trap is settling for too little, so it's the winner's curse. Making too large a concession and getting too small a slice of the pie. Another negotiation trap is walking away from the table. Rejecting an offer that's demonstrably better than any other option, so pride. And then the last negotiation trap is settling for terms that are worse than your best alternative. So this is called agreement bias. So negotiators feel the need to agree or reach an agreement even if it's worse than the other alternatives. So let's take a look at becoming an effective negotiator. So you have to consider 4 key objectives when assessing the quality of contracts. First is, what's the likelihood of reaching a good agreement? And then you ask yourself, does the agreement fulfill its intended purpose? And then, will the agreement last? And then, will the agreement lead to subsequent negotiations? So prior to the negotiation, you'll initiate negotiation. And then there will be preparation, so planning worksheet, assess BATNA, develop reservation price, develop target price. And then you'll move on to the negotiation phase. And here you'll have the strategy, and here you'll have the opening, first offers, counter offers, concessions, etc. And then you'll have agreements, and there'll be efficiency, economic value, joint gain, etc. And then relational value, satisfaction, and fairness. And then post-negotiations, you'll have post-deal implementation, durability, reputation, trust, etc. Now let's take a look at 3 key elements to improve your negotiation skills. So first is diagnostic feedback, and it allows you to learn from experience. The next is strategy, the analysis of success or failure of negotiation. And then the last key element to improving your negotiation skills is where you're focused on behavioral practice. So practice versus simulation. Now let's move on to debunking negotiation myths. So the first myth is that negotiations are fixed sum. So negotiations aren't purely combative. Parties who work together can create more joint value. The second negotiation myth is that you need to be either tough or soft. Negotiators must be principled, leverage power while still cooperating and working effectively with others. The third myth is that good negotiators are born with the skill. So these skills can be learned or taught. Good negotiations involve engaging with people on a daily basis. Practice and feedback feed negotiations. The last myth is that good negotiators rely on their intuition. Negotiation must be systematic, research-driven, and deliberate, not based on intuition. Now we move on to preparation, what to do before negotiation with Chapter 2. So first let's address the fixed pie perception. So most negotiators believe whatever's good for one party must be bad for the counterparty. People with this fixed pie perception take one of 3 mindsets when preparing for a negotiation. They either surrender or yield to the counterparty, prepare for hard bargaining with the counterparty, or compromise in an attempt to reach a midpoint between opposing demands. It's commonly assumed that concessions are necessary by one or both parties to reach an agreement. The fixed pie perception is almost always wrong and often leads to an ineffective approach to negotiations. Now let's talk about mixed motive decision making. So this is a more effective and accurate model of negotiation involving both cooperation and competition. So effective preparation for a negotiation encompasses 3 general abilities: self-assessment, perspective taking, and situational awareness. let's look deeper into self-assessment. So you need to identify your ideal outcome or target, what you want. And three problems may arise here: an under-aspiring negotiator, so winner's curse, an over-aspiring or positional negotiator, or a grass is greener negotiator. So they may drop a good deal for a less beneficial one. So then you have to look at what is your BOTNA. So this is your best alternative to the negotiated agreement. So BOTNAs aren't wishful, they're factual. And your BOTNA is time sensitive. Don't let the other party manipulate your BOTNA. Negotiators should be willing to accept any set of terms superior to their BOTNA. And then you have to take a look at what's your reservation point. So this is the reservation point, or the quantification of your BOTNA with respect to other alternatives. So you should brainstorm your alternatives, evaluate and order each alternative's value, attempt to improve your BOTNA, and determine your reservation price based on facts. So in an example of someone trying to sell their house, you have to determine their reservation price and their target prices. So if Frida's the seller, what is her reservation price? So the reservation price is the absolute minimum she can sell her house for. And this is the amount she still owes plus the deposit she saved. So this is the absolute minimum she can afford to sell her house for. And then Frida's target price is what she put the house in the market for. And then John, the buyer's reservation price, is the maximum he can buy it for. So this is the amount the bank will give him for the house plus what he saved for the deposit. So this is the maximum he can afford, including financing. And then John's target price is John's offer for the house to Frida. And then let's say Frida eventually agrees to sell her house to John for $1.285 million. So Frida's surplus would be the settlement amount minus her reservation point. So the $1.285 million minus the $1.275 million, and her surplus would be $10,000. Then John's surplus would be the $1.285 million minus the $1.4 million. So the target is what you open with, and the reservation point, or the reserve maximum, is the minimum she can afford to sell her house for, or John's reserve maximum, which is the maximum he can afford to buy the house for. But then what about the BATNA for the parties? The best alternative to the negotiated agreement? Well, for Frida, it's moving to the townhouse complex. And then for John, it's not buying, or buying an alternative house. And then what is the bargaining zone? Well, this is the difference or gap between the two reservation prices. So the $1.275 million and the $1.4 million. And you list it as a range, it's not a difference. So now let's talk about setting up the negotiation. So when determining your reservation point, be aware of the following. First is focal points. Numbers may appear to be valid but have no basis. And then we have sunk costs. This is money already invested that's irrecoverable. For example, the purchase price of a house. And you mustn't confuse your target point with your reservation point. Identify the issues in the negotiation, identify the alternatives for each issue, and identify multi-issue proposals of equivalent value. So packages should all be of equivalent value or attractiveness. Now let's talk about risk and uncertainty. So most people are risk-seeking when it comes to gains and risk-averse when it comes to losses. Reservation points define what people consider to be a gain or a loss. Now let's talk about assessing your risk propensity. So first we have strategic risk. So this is the riskiness of the tactics that negotiators use at the bargaining table. For example, agreeing to co-author. Then we have BOTNA risk. Given BATNAs of equal expected value, the more risk-averse negotiator will be in a weaker bargaining position. For example, potential offers with no real offers for a job. Then we talk about contractual risk, and this refers to the risk associated with the willingness of the other party to honor its terms. For example, signing an NDA. Now let's talk about endowment effect. So this is about the differences in negotiators' reference points, and this may lead buyers and sellers to have different valuations for the same objective. So someone who possesses an object has a reference point that reflects their current endowment or private valuation of the object. The difference between what sellers demand and what buyers are willing to pay is a manifestation of loss aversion. Now let's talk a bit about buyer's remorse and seller's regret, so counterfactual thinking. In negotiation, immediate acceptance of a first offer by the counterparty often means a better outcome for the proposing negotiator, but the outcome is less satisfying. Thinking about what could have been but didn't occur may be a reference point for the psychological evaluation of actual outcomes. And now let's talk a bit about negotiator confidence. So the overconfidence effect refers to a negotiator's unwarranted level of confidence in the judgment of their abilities and the likelihood of positive events. The effect also causes people to underestimate the likelihood of negative events. Now let's talk a bit about perspective taking. Once a negotiator has thought about their own partner, reservation point, target point, and interests, it's time to identify information about the other negotiation parties. So who are the other parties or counterparties? Are the parties monolithic of one voice or opinion? Identify counterparties' interests and positions, and research the counterparties' partners. So what about situational awareness? Well, research related to the details of a negotiation situation is also critical to successful negotiation outcomes. So you need to ask yourself, is the negotiation one-shot, long-term, or repetitive? Is the negotiation a transaction or a dispute situation? For example, a contract worker wants to be treated the same as a full-time employee. Then you also ask yourself, are linkage effects present? For example, multinational, one negotiation affects another. Are the negotiations false or sincere? Is it legal to negotiate? Is ratification required? For example, must the contract be approved by another party? Are there time constraints or time-related costs? Are the contracts official or unofficial? Are negotiators public or private? And lastly, you ask yourself if third-party intervention is possible. Now let's talk about time constraints. So all negotiations have time-related costs. Two negotiators may face radically different time-related costs, but a deadline for one is a deadline for the other. The rate of concessions made by negotiators increases as negotiators approach deadlines. Setting a final deadline on the negotiations can be helpful, especially if passage of time is particularly costly. If a deal isn't reached by a point, they must exercise their partner. Now let's move on to distributive negotiations with Chapter 3. So the bargaining zone, or the zone of possible agreements, ZOPA, represents the range between each party's reservation points. In a positive bargaining zone, negotiators' reservation points overlap, and then in a negative bargaining zone, there's no positive overlap between parties' reservation points. Therefore, parties should pursue other alternatives rather than wasting time trying to reach an agreement. So from a diagram, you can see that the buyer and the seller's reservation point overlap, and the buyer and the seller's bargaining range overlap. And when they don't overlap, it's a negative bargaining zone. So the bargaining surplus is the amount of overlap between the negotiating parties' reservation points. And the bargaining surplus is a measure of the value that a negotiated agreement offers to both parties compared to the value of not reaching a settlement. And negotiator's surplus is the positive difference between the settlement outcome and the negotiator's reservation point. And the total surplus of both parties adds up to the size of the ZOPA, or bargaining surplus. And the bargaining surplus illustrates the mixed motive nature of negotiation. Negotiators are motivated to both cooperate and compete with the other party. And obviously, a party's surplus is the settlement amount minus their reservation point. So some value claiming strategies involve accurately assessing your BATNA, unpacking your multiple alternatives, improving your BATNA, determining your reservation point but don't reveal it, researching the counterparty's BATNA and estimating their reservation point, and setting high aspirations. Be realistic but optimistic. Now let's talk about first offers. So let's take a look at the AIM model. So the anchoring information model, or AIM, states that first offers have two effects. They serve as anchors that pull final settlements towards the initial first offer value, and they convey information about the sender's priorities, which makes the sender vulnerable to exploitation and increases the risk of a first mover disadvantage. So in terms of first offers, let's talk about symmetric and asymmetric information. So where the negotiator has good information and the counterparty is believed to also have good information, it's wise to make the first offer. When negotiators have good information, they're not likely to fall prey to the winner's curse or the chilling effect. Instead, they can make an assertive opening offer that operates as a psychological anchor. And if you don't have good information, let the other party open first. So don't make the first offer in this situation. If the counterparty doesn't have good information, but you do, let them open first. But if you both don't have good information, you can offer first. And then in terms of asymmetric information, when one party is prepared and has good information and the counterparty doesn't, the prepared negotiator doesn't run the risk of being anchored by the counterparty. And in this situation, the non-prepared negotiator can be anchored by the prepared party, and also has a higher risk of falling victim to the winner's curse. And obviously, it's advantageous to the informed party to prompt the naive party to make the first offer. Let's take a look at range offers. So the key disadvantage of stating a range is that the counterparty may focus overwhelmingly on the attractive endpoint from their point of view. So essentially, they'll just focus on the lower end of the range and negotiate down from there. And then in terms of precise versus round numbers, people habitually use round numbers as first offers in negotiation, but then precise offers are more potent than round number anchors. And this is because they're viewed as based on more information and greater negotiator competence. but they only work when the recipient is an amateur. It backfires if they're an expert. Now let's talk about early versus late first offers. So late first offers are more likely to lead to creative agreements that meet parties' interests compared to early first offers. Late first offers give negotiators more time to learn about each other's interests. And now let's talk about counter offers, so re-anchoring. So this is essentially diminishing the prominence of the counterparty's initial offer as an anchor point. And they signal your willingness to negotiate. But then what are concessions? Well, these are reductions that a negotiator makes during the course of a negotiation. So negotiators must consider 4 things when formulating counteroffers and concessions. So the first is concession reciprocity, the pattern of concessions, the magnitude of concessions, and the timing of concessions. Now let's talk about concession reciprocity versus aversion. So concession reciprocity is the tendency of negotiators to reciprocate concessions. And then concession aversion is the tendency for some negotiators to be disinclined to make concessions. Now let's take a look at concession patterns. So unilateral concessions is where concessions are made by one party. And then bilateral concessions are concessions made by both sides. And then premature concessions is when one party makes more than one concession in a row before the other party responds or counter offers. Now we move on to concession magnitude. So this is where you determine how much to concede. Negotiators are advised to match the concession magnitude of the counterparty. And then negotiators can signal they're getting near the reservation point by reducing the size of their concessions. So when it comes to concessions, we have the graduated reduction in tension model, or the GRIT model. So this is a conflict resolution method in which parties avoid escalating conflict to reach mutual settlement within the bargaining zone. And this is based on the reciprocity principle. We also have the even split ploy. So this is where one party suggests meeting in the middle of the offer that's currently on the table. Now let's take a look at the timing of concessions. So this is whether they're immediate, gradual, or delayed. So sellers who make immediate concessions receive the most negative reactions from buyers. When sellers make gradual concessions, the buyer's reaction is most positive, with high satisfaction. So but what is substantiation? Well, this is the arguments or persuasive rationale that often accompanies an offer. So ideally, a rationale that's objective is presented and it invites the counterparty to buy into the rationale. Conversely, if your facts can be easily counter-argued by the other party, you won't benefit from making arguments. You should base negotiations on facts. So in terms of substantiation, let's take a look at constraints versus disparagement. So constraint rationales refer to one's own limited resources. For example, I can't pay more than whatever. But then disparagement rationales are critiquing the negotiated object or service. For example, it's not worth more than this. So in terms of agreement versus option, the negotiator might label a proposal as an agreement or an option. But an agreement is preferred. And when holding the economic value of the proposal constant, the labeling of the proposal influences acceptance rates. So now let's talk about fairness arguments in terms of substantiation. So negotiators often use one of 3 fairness principles when slicing the pie. The first is the equality rule. It prescribes equal shares for all. Then we have the equity rule. It prescribes that distribution should be proportional to a person's contribution. And then we have the needs-based rule. It states that benefits should be proportional to needs. So egocentric judgments of fairness emerge when people select fairness rules in a self-serving fashion. So when people make minimal contributions, they prefer equality rather than equity. And when people's contributions are substantial, they opt for equity rather than equality. So in terms of relationships and fairness, an example is if you take the job that pays the most, so that's the rational judgment. Or you could take the job that pays the least, but you're treated fairly amongst peers. So in terms of the equity principle, equity exists in a relationship if each person's outcomes are proportional to their inputs. So equity is the equivalence of the input to outcome ratio of parties. Inequity is when the ratio of outcomes to inputs is unequal. But now let's talk about restoring equity. Well, people can restore equity by altering the inputs, altering the outcomes, cognitively distorting the inputs or outcomes, leaving the situation, cognitively distorting either the inputs or the outcomes of an exchange partner, or changing the object of comparison. And then in terms of final offers, you should walk away from the bargaining table if your BATNA is more attractive than the counterparty's offer. And then face is the value a person places on their public image, reputation, and status. Vis-a-vis. So direct threats to face could be making ultimatums, criticisms, challenges, and insults. And when a person's face is threatened, it can shift their behavior away from cooperation toward competition. So the best way to help the other party save face is to not indicate that you think they've lost face. Now we move on to integrative negotiation and expanding the pie with Chapter 4. So most negotiators are motivated to search for integrative or win-win agreements because they involve the creation of mutual gain. And then false conflict is where negotiators believe their interests are incompatible when they actually share compatible interests. So this is the lose-lose effect. And then we have the fixed pie perception. So this is the belief that the counterparty's interests are directly opposed to one's own interests. So both of these things prevents reaching win-win negotiations. And then compromise refers to reaching a middle ground between negotiators' positions. And then even splits, like compromises, refer to how the bargaining zone is divided among negotiators. But this doesn't mean the agreement is a win-win though. So truly integrative agreements are ones in which all opportunities are leveraged so that no resources are left on the table. And we call these outcomes Pareto optimal. So what is the Pareto efficient frontier? Well, this is the set of outcomes corresponding to the entire set of agreements that leave no portion of the total amount of available resources unallocated. So some of the strategies that can help negotiators create integrative potential is identifying multiple issues, so what one gains another loses. Bring additional issues, this allows for concessions. Allow side deals, so this also allows for parties to add on. And capitalize on differing strengths of preference. So what are the strategies for expanding the pie? So this helps create win-win agreements. So the first thing is separating positions or demands from interests. And then we have perspective taking, so walk a mile in the other party's shoes. Another strategy is asking questions about interests and priorities. And this allows for better understanding. So you get to know about timing, priorities, preferences, and helps discover where value lies. And diagnostic questions mean negotiators don't misrepresent themselves. Then another strategy for expanding the pie is revealing information about interests and priorities. So this is a negotiation paradox, so you say a lot without giving away everything, and it allows for reciprocity. Another thing you can do is unbundling the issues. So focus on more than one issue, for example price. And then you can take a look at value-added trade-offs like log rolling, and you can make gains on some of the issues addressed. And lastly, another strategy for expanding the pie is looking at multi-issue offers. So you shouldn't negotiate issues independently of others. This is because it affects the ability to assess trade-offs. For example, looking at nurses versus teachers' hours versus actual capacity issues. Now let's take a look at the meso strategy for expanding the pie. So this is making multiple offers of equivalent value simultaneously, mesos. So you'll have to devise multiple issue offers, devise offers that are all of equal value to yourself, and then make all of the offers at the same time. And lastly, you should tell the counterparty they can't cherry pick the best parts from different offers. So some of the advantages of the meso strategy is that they can be more aggressive in anchoring. You can gain better information about the counterparty, you can be more persistent, you can signal your priorities more effectively, and you can overcome concession aversion. And then in terms of contingent contracts, we can look at differences. So negotiators can exploit differences to capitalize on integrative agreements. So you can look at differences in valuation, differences in expectations, differences in risk attitudes, pro or averse, differences in time preferences, when, and differences in capabilities, quality versus quantity. So contingent contracts should not create a conflict of interest. They should focus on the negotiation, not just making bets. They must be enforceable and may therefore require a written contract. And they should be clear, measurable, and readily evaluated. Now let's take a look at pre-settlement settlements, so PRES. So these have three characteristics. First thing is that they're formal, so they encompass specific binding obligations. And then they're initial, so they occur in advance of the parties undertaking full-scale negotiations and are designed to be replaced by a long-term agreement. And lastly, PRES settlements are partial, so parties don't address or resolve all outstanding issues. Now let's take a look at post-settlement settlements. So here negotiators agree to explore other options with the goal of finding another option that both prefer more than the current agreement. And because they can safely revert to their previous agreement, the post-settlement settlement strategy allows both parties to reveal their preferences without fear of exploitation. So the framework of an integrative negotiation has 5 components. First is resource assessment. Then we have the assessment of differences, offers and trade-offs, acceptance or rejection decision, and then prolonging the negotiation and renegotiation. Now we move on to understanding personality and motivation with Chapter 5. So negotiation behavior is shaped by negotiators' personalities and also by how they view the counterparty and the world. So these individual differences can often be measured and reliably used to predict negotiation performance. So implicit theories are beliefs held by people about personalities. So awareness of one's own negotiation style would lead to successful negotiation. But then what is the line crossing illusion? So the line crossing illusion is where negotiators believe they're coming on too strong, but they're actually not. So they basically believe they're revealing more than they are. So the goal of understanding personality in negotiation is to better predict the behavior of the counterparty. And acoustic and visual cues can be used to predict the likely behavior of a counterparty to a proposal. But now let's take a look at the big 5 personality traits that can reliably be measured and predict behavior in different situations. So we have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So ocean. But now let's take a look at psychopathic traits. So negotiators with psychopathic personality traits have a more competitive worldview. And this includes more selfish social motivations and the illusion of conflict with others. They tend to make more money when success favors competitive actions, but lose money when success depends on cooperation. But what is dyadic interaction? Well, this is the relationship between two people. Negotiator dyads with complementary personality styles are more likely to reach integrative agreements. Now let's take a look at attachment theory. Well, attachment theory argues that people develop different attachment styles to others. Let's take a look at the 3 most studied attachment styles. So first is secure attachment. So they're usually more confident. And then we have avoidant attachment. And lastly, we have insecure or anxious attachment. And negotiators with avoidant attachment styles have a greater propensity to negotiate with an insecurely attached counterparty. Now let's talk about motivational orientation. So these are the goals that people have in social interactions and particularly in negotiations. So people have different orientations toward the process of negotiation. So we have cooperative, competitive, and individualistic. So in terms of the individualistic orientation, their objective is self-interest, their view of others is self-interested, and the situational factors that trigger this motivational orientation are incentives to maximize own gain. In terms of competitive motivational orientation, their objective is victory, they're competitive, and the situational factors that trigger this motivational orientation is group competition, and when organizations make interpersonal comparisons apparent. In terms of the cooperative orientation, their objective is joint welfare. Their view of others is that some people are cooperative, some are competitive, and some are individualistic. And then situational factors that trigger this motivational orientation are social identity and superordinate status goals. Now let's take a look at some advice for cooperative negotiators. Well, the first is avoid becoming anchored by your reservation price. Develop your BATNA, try to improve it. Get an agent and delegate the negotiation task. Or you can also find a constituency. This is because people negotiate more assertively when they're accountable to other people. And lastly, you can monitor your concessions, rehearse not saying yes to the first offer. Now let's take a look at advice for competitive negotiators or psychopathic negotiators. So first, you need to focus on value creation, not exclusively on value claiming. And then you need to ask more questions than you think you should. Understand their needs, and then focus on fairness. Other people respond well to arguments based upon standards of fairness and objectivity. You can also hire a relationship manager, and then practice good faith bargaining, so keep your word. And lastly, focus on the long-term relationship. Very few negotiations are one-off, focus on the relationship. So the downside to cooperative personalities is that often two cooperators end up with a lose-lose agreement because they fail to make their interests known to the other party. And then competitive negotiators desire to maximize the difference between their own and the other party's outcomes, thereby beating the other party. But this is bad because as negotiators become more adversarial, irritating, stubborn, and unethical, their effectiveness as a negotiator declines. And then individualistic negotiators prefer to maximize their own gain and are indifferent to how much the other party receives. When individualistically motivated negotiators are at the table, distributive strategies increase, for example, positional statements, substantiation, etc. Now let's take a look at gender and negotiation. So men are more successful than women in terms of claiming value, and this is mainly due to opening offers, as they reveal the negotiator's aspirations. Women set lower aspirations and therefore ask for less in their opening offers. Now let's take a look at the 4 key reasons that act as barriers to women when they ask for what they want. So first is that they don't feel a given situation is a negotiation. They think they'll be given things when they quote-unquote deserve them. They don't establish aggressive goals, and they don't want to damage the relationship. But now let's talk about the backlash effect. So this relates to why women are less likely to initiate negotiations, why they ask for less, and settle for less money. So this is because they encounter social and economic backlash when they behave assertively at the bargaining table. And women who ask or self-advocate are viewed more negatively than men who self-advocate. Some investigations find that women who initiate negotiations are less likely to achieve their goals and are more likely to economically suffer. Now let's talk about lying and misrepresentation. So men are more likely to endorse and engage in lying than women in a negotiation. Men feel more competitive than women, and greater competitiveness is associated with increased lying. When women are prompted to feel competitive and men are prompted to feel empathy, gender differences in lying are reduced. Now let's talk about stereotype regeneration. So stereotype regeneration is the process by which members of traditionally stereotyped groups redefine their own beliefs about their group. So by exposing negative stereotypes and then attacking them mentally, women can do much better at the bargaining table. And when women negotiate on behalf of someone other than themselves, for example, family, children, constituency, gender differences are minimized as compared to when they negotiate for themselves. So when they're accountable to a larger group, they're more comfortable and more likely to express their interests and make more assertive offers and hold out for a better set of terms. So now we move on to managing emotions and contentious behavior with chapter 6. So what are emotions? Well, these are fleeting states that can be fairly intense and often a result of a particular experience. But then what are moods? Well, moods are more chronic and are usually not directed at someone. But now let's take a look at genuine versus strategic emotion. So genuine emotion is authentic, behavioral manifestations of felt emotions. And then strategic emotion is contrived, carefully designed orchestrations to take the counterparty off guard. Let's take a look at some of the emotional styles. So we've got rational, positive, and negative styles. In terms of rational, their focus is to conceal or repress emotion. In terms of distributive strategies, they invoke norms of fair distribution. And then in terms of integrative strategies, they do a systematic analysis of interests. And the implication for future negotiations and relationships is that they may come across as distant. In terms of a positive emotional style, they create positive emotion in the other party and create rapport. They may compromise for the sake of the relationship in terms of distributive strategies. Their positive emotion stimulates creative thinking for integrative strategies. And then in terms of future negotiations and relationship, there's greater feelings of commitment to the relationship partner. But now let's take a look at the negative emotional style. So they use irrational appearing emotions to intimidate or control the other party. They use threats and often tough bargaining when it comes to distributive strategies. And their negative emotion may stop integrative bargaining. And the effect on future negotiations and relationship is that they might have pressure to carry out the threats or lose credibility. So but now, what is a strategic flinch? Well, this is a verbal or physical display of shock, disgust, or disbelief made to an opening offer. And negotiators who flinch claim more value than negotiators who don't flinch. So deliberate attempts to conceal emotions is another type of contrived emotion. So feigning rapport, so my friend, with the counterparty is useful for garnering concessions. Joyful emotions are recommended to be kept hidden from the counterparty. And then in terms of anger, negotiators who express anger are often successful in eliciting concessions, but then anger can also impair a negotiator's goal attainment, result in less profitable outcomes, and be detrimental for the development of joint gains. So anger is most effective in mixed motive negotiations that involve both cooperation and competition. So negotiators are more effective in extracting concessions from the counterparty if they make a threat as compared to acting angry. So what are the other costs of expressing anger? So incidental expressions of anger in a negotiator's past can influence trust in unrelated settings in the negotiator's future. And it could jeopardize post-negotiation deal implementation, so the blowback effect. But now let's talk a bit about disappointment. So communicating disappointment results in greater success when it evokes guilt in the counterparty, and is more effective when you've known the person for longer, and even better in a group. But now let's talk about sadness and empathy. So sadness and empathy improves negotiators' performance more than rational appeals, and it can increase concession making by the counterparty. But remember, when high-power negotiators use sympathy, they suffer a relational cost because their sympathy appeals are seen as less appropriate or manipulative. Now let's talk a bit about ambivalence. So this is having mixed feelings about something or someone. So negotiators who express emotional ambivalence may pave the way toward creation of joint gain. So it elicits inferences of submissiveness, thereby motivating a negotiator to create more integrative agreements. So but what is emotional intelligence? Well, this is the ability of people to understand emotions in themselves and to use emotional knowledge to lead to positive outcomes. And this helps with conflict adaptability. So conflict adaptability is a negotiator's ability to adapt their strategy to different conflict dilemmas in accordance with the demands of a situation. And then negotiation resilience inventory predicts negotiators' ability to respond and cope with challenging situations. And the ability to accurately read emotions in others, for example, facial expressions in the counterparty, is important for successful outcomes. Now let's talk about managing emotions. So what are some of the emotional trigger words and phrases? So the first type of emotional trigger is labeling the other person negatively. And the words you could use here is unfair, silly, liar, stupid. The other type is telling the other person what to do or what they can't do. Words used here can be can't, must, never, should. Another emotional trigger is appealing to a higher source. Blaming or abdicating responsibility. Words you can use here are fair, ethical, moral, better. And then another trigger is being rude, not listening, explicative, insincere praises, sarcasm, and educating the other person. And words someone can use here are whatever, you always, or you never. Another trigger is labeling your own behavior as superior. And words you can use here are reasonable, deserve, etc. And then the last type of emotional trigger is implied threats. And words you can use here are or else or either or. Now let's move on to disputes. So these are negotiations in which one party has made a claim and the other party has rejected that claim. In disputes, parties can't simply walk away and exercise their badness if they can't reach an agreement. Disputes often escalate to conflict as the parties engage in contentious behavior, for example, lawsuits, strikes, and protests. But now let's take a look at the three types of approaches when in the process of dispute resolution. So we have the interests, rights, and power model. So in terms of the interests approach, their goal is self-interest, and also dispute resolution and understanding the other's concerns. Their temporal focus is on the present, their distributive strategies is compromise, their integrative strategies is expanding the pie via addressing the party's underlying needs, and the implications for future negotiations and relationship is greater understanding, satisfaction, and stability of agreement. In terms of the rights approach, their goal is fairness and justice. Their temporal focus is on the past. It often ends in an unequal distribution, and it's difficult to expand the pie unless focus is on interests. And the implications for future negotiations and relationship is possible court action. And then in terms of the power approach, their goal is on winning and respect. Their temporal focus is on the future, and again, this approach also leads to unequal distribution, and again, it's difficult to expand the pie unless the focus is on interests. And then the implications for future negotiations and relationship is that there's resentment, possible retaliation, and revenge. So what are some things to consider when making a threat? Well, you need to consider how best to threaten the other party's interests, clarity about actions are needed, your credibility to carry out the threat, and you also need a way to save face. Let's talk a bit about social dilemmas. So negotiators are faced with the choice to cooperate or compete with the counterparty. People may engage in behaviors that maximize self-interests but then lead to collective disaster, for example, the prisoner's dilemma. But then let's talk about tit for tat. So this is a behavioral strategy that advises negotiators involved in a social dilemma to act pro-socially initially and then do exactly what the counterparty does in each subsequent interaction. But now let's talk about inducing trust and cooperation. So some strategies to induce win-win outcomes include, firstly, communicating, then clearly signaling your intentions, then using psychological contracts or handshake deals to pressure the counterparty to honor their commitments, looking at economics versus relationship, remembering that you're interacting with a person, not a company they work for, and then focusing on the benefits of cooperation. Now we move on to establishing trust and building relationships with Chapter 7. So a win-win agreement is one that allows negotiators to fully maximize whatever negotiators care about. And this can include love, money, services, goods, status, or information. So each of these valued resources varies in terms of particularism. So how much utility we derive depends on the provider. And then also concreteness, the tangibility of the resources. So subjective value inventory assesses four major concerns: feelings about instrumental outcomes, feelings about themselves, feelings about the process, and feelings about their relationships. But then what is rapport? Well, rapport is the feelings of closeness, understanding, and harmony among people in relationships. So the creation of rapport is primarily influenced by the counterparty's verbal behavior and the interaction behaviors of both negotiators. And in some situations, negotiators have asymmetric bargaining history, such that one party benefits at the expense of another. Now let's talk a bit about trust and temptation. So what is trust? Well, trust is the willingness to make oneself vulnerable to another person. But the paradox is that most negotiations offer some incentive for people to behave in an untrustworthy fashion. So, but what is trust propensity? Well, this is the negotiator's belief in others' trustworthiness, and this can increase information exchange and decrease distributive behaviors. So what are the three types of trust in relationships? Well, we have deterrence-based trust, knowledge-based trust, and identification-based trust. So deterrence-based trust is based on the consistency of behavior, following through on what you promise to do. And then knowledge-based trust is grounded in behavioral predictability, when you have enough information about a person to understand them and accurately predict their behavior. And then we get to identification-based trust. So this is grounded in complete empathy for another person's desires and intentions, so familiarity. Now let's talk about building trust. So first we can build trust through cognitive or rational and deliberate means of influence. So this involves transforming relationship conflict into task conflict, agreeing on a common goal, a shared vision, capitalizing on social network connections, finding a shared problem, a common enemy, and focusing on the future. And then we can also build trust through psychological, so intuition or emotional strategies, so affective strategies. So first you can use the similarity attraction effect. So negotiators are likely to make concessions for people they know and like. Then you can use the mere exposure effect. So the more we're exposed to something, the more we like it. And then we have physical proximity. The closer you are to someone physically, the more likely you are to form a relationship or friendship. And then we have the reciprocity principle. So we feel obligated to return what others have offered or given to us. Then we have schmoozing or small talk. So short exchanges can lead to developing trust. And then we have flattery. So people like others who appreciate and admire them. Then we have mimicry and mirroring. So negotiators who mimic mannerisms of their opponents secure better outcomes and greater joint gain. And lastly, we have self-affirmation. So the negotiator focuses on important personal value. Now let's talk about distrust and suspicion. So what are some of the situations that lead to distrust? Well, this could be trust breaches or defections, a high need for closure, so how certain they want to be about situations, dispositional attributions, so this could be when someone questions another person's character and intentions by saying they're the cause of a behavior or incident. And then we have situational attribution. This is when someone cites one or more situational factors as the cause of a behavior or incident. And then we have focusing on the bad apple. So this could be focusing on the one person in the team that has a bad reputation for being less trustworthy, tougher, less easy to work with than other members of the group. But now let's take a look at the key components of an apology. So first we have the expression of regret, then an explanation, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, an offer of repair, and request for forgiveness. So in terms of an expression of regret, the negotiator expresses sorrow that they offended the counterparty. And then in terms of explanation, the negotiator explains the reasons for their actions. Then in terms of acknowledgement of responsibility, the negotiator assumes some responsibility for the offense. And then the negotiator vows to change their future behavior in terms of declaration of repentance. Then in terms of an offer of repair, the negotiator takes steps to rebuild trust. And then lastly, the negotiator asks to be forgiven. Now let's talk about relationships and negotiation. Negotiators who reach an impasse in a prior negotiation are more likely to do the same in their next negotiation or reach a low value goal. But now let's talk about negotiating with friends. So interpersonal relationships influence negotiators' expectations, and they expect more generous negotiation offers from close people. So what is unmitigated communion? So this is where people believe they should be responsive to others' needs and not assert their own needs. So but what is relational accommodation? So this is when people make economic sacrifices to preserve relationships. And then what are communal norms? Well, communal norms mandate that we should take care of people we love, respond to their needs, and not keep track of who's put in what. But then what about exchange norms? So this mandates we should keep track of who has invested what in the relationship and what they'll be compensated based on their inputs. So this is the opposite of communal norms. And we should know that friends are less competitive with each other than they are with strangers. And negotiators in a relationship are often unable to profitably exploit opportunities to create value. But now let's talk about status and rank, so hierarchy. So if people see themselves as egalitarian, they're less likely to expand the pie but like each other more. But then if people see themselves as part of a hierarchy, they're more likely to expand the pie, but they don't feel as good about the relationship. So what is swift trust? So this is building trust with people very rapidly, with little information and with no expected meaningful future interaction. But let's talk about the myth of the one-shot business situation. So social networks mean people in a business interaction, even if they don't interact again, their companies will interact again, or others in their social network will become aware of the interaction. And this will affect future business interactions. But now let's talk about multiplex relationships. So this is when friends and family do business, and the relationship is more complex and is known as an embedded relationship. But then the pitfalls of embedded relationships include the fact that emotional potential is higher and interpersonal conflict can result. And you often experience internal value conflicts. And it may create a myopia if people are reluctant to move beyond their own networks, so sticky ties. But now we move on to power, ethics, and reputation of Chapter 8. So power in a negotiation can be analyzed from 4 vantage points: potential power, perceived power, power tactics, and realized power. So potential power is the underlying capacity of negotiators to obtain benefits from an agreement. And it's a function of the counterparty's dependence on you. And then perceived power is a negotiator's assessment of each party's potential power, which may not align with reality. And then we have power tactics. These are behaviors designed to use or change the power relationship. Then we look at realized power. This is the extent to which negotiators claim benefits from an interaction. And then in terms of these sources of power, we have hard and soft power, legitimate, expert, reward, coercive power, etc. But what about BATNAs as power? When negotiators have a great BATNA, they have power. It's imperative that negotiators cultivate and improve their BATNAs prior to negotiating by doing the following: keeping your options open, signaling your BATNA but not revealing it, and researching the other party's BATNA. But now let's take a look at asymmetric versus symmetric power. So how does the balance of power between negotiators affect the processes and outcomes of negotiation? So for symmetric high power dyads, value creation is associated with increased mutual accommodation. And then for symmetric low power dyads, value creation is associated with greater contentiousness. And then for asymmetric power dyads, they maximize value creation when they adopt a neutral stance. And you should know, when powerful negotiators engage in perspective taking, negotiators share more information, they develop more accurate judgments, and negotiate better outcomes. And they avoid egocentrically biased goals and inequitable information sharing. But now let's also take a look at status. So power and status are correlated. Status is based on respect and esteem from others. And then power is based on the capacity to control resources and outcomes of yourself and others. And they have similar positive effects on how dominant we think someone is. But then power has a negative effect on how warm we think someone is. But status moderates this power penalty. And groups of high power individuals may fight over relative status in the group, and they may have worse negotiation performance. But now let's take a look at the two types of status characteristics that are relevant in most negotiation situations. So first we have primary status characteristics. So these are indicators of legitimate authority, for example, rank, degree, title. And then we have secondary status characteristics. So these are cues and attributes that have no legitimate bearing on the allocation of resources or on the norms of interaction, but nevertheless exert a powerful influence on behavior. For example, gender, age, ethnicity, cultural background, etc. So but what is ethics? Well, this is the manifestation of cultural, contextual, and interpersonal norms that render certain strategies or behaviors unacceptable. But now let's take a look at some of the ethically questionable strategies in negotiation. So first is traditional competitive bargaining. And then we have manipulation of an opponent's network, so multiple negotiators. And then making false promises, misrepresentation, inappropriate information gathering, and strategic misrepresentation of positive or negative emotion. But now let's take a look at personality differences. So a negotiator's attitude toward competitive unethical tactics, or their empathy toward the counterparty, their tendency to suppress emotion, as well as their entity views of the counterparty's skills and traits, are all personality predictors that can indicate a negotiator's propensity to engage in ethically questionable negotiation behaviors. But now let's take a look at situational influences for lying. Well, first is the lure of temptation, then we have uncertainty, then powerlessness, the anonymity of victims, when we think the other party's lying, and also perspective taking or exploitation avoidance. So what are the costs of lying? Well, the liar can be caught and face criminal charges, and one's reputation and trustworthiness can be damaged. And it can lead to a culture in which everyone in the organization lies and general suspicion increases. And a negotiator that lies about their reservation price effectively decreases the bargaining zone and increases the probability of an impasse. And you should know, when negotiators believe that negotiation abilities are malleable, so easily influenced, they're more likely to lose their trust in the counterparty following deception. Conversely, people who believe that negotiators' characteristics and abilities are fixed maintain their first impressions of the counterparty, even after learning they were deceived. Now let's take a look at sins of omission and commission. So what is lying by commission? So this is active lying, and this is more unethical than sins of omission. And then we have lying by omission. So it's possible to withhold information and not be regarded as unethical, but willful shielding of material information doesn't exonerate the negotiator. And then what is paltering? Well, this is the active use of truthful statements to convey a misleading impression. So how do we go about detecting deception in negotiation? Well, we could look at pupil dilation. This is a physiological cue that's not under direct physical control. And dilating pupils are a cue to honesty, and constricting pupils are dishonesty. And then we could also look at linguistics. So if you use fewer first-person pronouns like I or we, you're likely lying. And then if you have a higher word count, you're likely omitting. But now let's move on to bounded rationality or ethicality. So this refers to the limits of people to make ethical decisions because they're either unaware or fail to fully and deliberately process information. And then unbounded rationality is thinking about all the outcomes. So how should a negotiator respond to unethical behavior? Well, they should focus on neutralizing the counterparty's unethical tactics. And negotiators who are suspicious are more effective at the bargaining table. And by signaling the risks and disadvantages of unethical behavior to the counterparty, negotiators may neutralize the likelihood that the opponent will engage in unethical behavior. Now let's talk about reputation. So reputation is the socially constructed labels of people's first and second-hand experiences with someone that provides representations which organize our perceptions of other people. And reputations are judgmental, consistent, immediate, and inferential. But what about the halo effect? So once we decide that someone is trustworthy, other qualities about this person are perceived as consistent with this favorable impression. And then what about the forked tail effect? Well, once we form a negative impression of someone, we tend to view everything else about them in a negative fashion. But now let's talk about negotiation communities. So managers' reputations are built quickly in negotiation communities. And people who are more socially networked are more likely to develop reputations that are difficult to change. So some reputations from least to most cooperative are liar manipulator, to tough but honest, nice and reasonable, to cream puff. Now let's talk about distributive versus integrative reputations with novice negotiators. So when novice negotiators interact with expert negotiators with distributive reputations, they evaluate them more negatively and use more distributive and less integrative negotiation strategies, ultimately reducing joint gain. Conversely, when novices are told that the expert counterparty has an integrative reputation, they disclose information about their interests, needs, and priorities, which results in higher joint gains.